Okay, so we're going to go over the cutting head of this machine. It's real important to take care of it a certain way, torque specs and everything. So every time this machine comes back from rental, again, we want to check these cutters if we need to replace these cutters. So we're going to loosen these nuts on each of these, okay? These cutters can actually be turned 3 different times. Once you loosen these nuts, they have to be retorqued down, okay? It's real important that we get these torqued down to the correct torque specs. And you can look in the parts book and it will also refer you to the torque specs that the cutters are and the bolts for the pockets. As far as the cutters go, so when you put the new cutters on there or you're turning the cutters, these have to be torqued down to 35 foot-pounds each time you loosen them. You have to retorque them down. Really critical that they get torqued down to the correct specs because we don't want any parts flying off the machine when it's in operation. It could cause somebody to get hurt, okay? So also, we have these pockets here. They have a bolt going in opposite directions on both sides. These bolts and these pockets have to get replaced periodically. When they do get worn out and replaced, again, we're going to be putting a new tooth in there possibly at the same time. We want to torque these down, the actual cutting teeth, but we also need to torque the pockets down. The pockets have to be torqued down to 240 foot-pounds, okay? And so make sure you're using the correct torque wrench for it, and no extensions or anything like that on your torque wrench. If you're replacing a pocket, you're supposed to replace the bolts also. The bolts will actually stretch when you're torquing them down, and each time you're supposed to just replace them. That'll stop the bolts from actually breaking. So 240 foot-pounds on the bolts, 35 foot-pounds on the actual cutters themselves, and we always want to make sure we put new nylock nuts on here when we're replacing or turning the cutters. Never use a standard nut on the top of these. Make sure there is a washer in between the nut and the actual pocket itself. There's a washer right here in between. Make sure you put that washer in there the correct way also. It does look kind of like a little ice cream cone. It sits inside the pocket. It's kind of like at an angle, or it'll sit actually recessed inside the pocket. So make sure you put that in there the correct way also. Another thing is when we're maintaining this head on this machine, we always want to make sure that we check to make sure that there's on both sides of here, we got our Zerk fittings. We also want to make sure that we are checking, there's several nuts and bolts in here. Make sure that everything is tight, everything is there. Make sure that nothing has came through, rocks, debris, hit these, broken them, taken them off. And they're on both sides of the machine here. We have more of them on this side. Make sure nothing's came up and hit these, damaged them, broke them off. If so, just replace them. Also, on the cutter head, there's more bolts that hold the actual shaft of the cutting head, and there's a whole row of them wraps around this whole ring here. Make sure that they're there, not worn up. If they do start to see a lot of wear, we just replace them. You want to make sure that all of those are nice and tight and they're there for safety purposes. And the other thing is while we're in here, we're going to check these bearings here. We're going to look for debris as far as wire, rocks, dirt, string, rope, anything like that. If there is something wrapped around this shaft, you just want to cut it out of there, get it out of there away from that bearing. Same thing on the other side. Check this side, make sure that nothing is wrapped around that head, because that'll cause other damage down the road. So that's a real important key. And then, like I said, can't stress enough, make sure that these two get greased every day. That's all there is to this cutting head.